I didn't realize until much later that my father had already decided I was on my own, long before I ever truly understood what that meant. It wasn't a shouted word or a slamming door, but a quiet, almost imperceptible withdrawal that left a void far deeper than any argument ever could. A father's absence. The unspoken truth. Emotional distance. He was a man of routines, of quiet order. My father, Arthur, always had a tidy garage, a well-manicured lawn, and a calm demeanor. He was the kind of man neighbors admired, the one who offered a polite nod and a helpful suggestion about a leaky faucet. But within the walls of our home, his presence was more like a carefully constructed facade. The illusion of peace. My mother, Eleanor, navigated his silences with a practiced grace, a delicate dance around the unspoken. She'd fill the quiet spaces with anecdotes, with questions directed at me, always trying to bridge the gap that seemed to widen with every passing year. Her efforts, though loving, often felt like they were reinforcing the very absence she tried to mask. A quiet retreat. This wasn't about overt cruelty. It was about a constant, low hum of emotional unavailability that shaped everything. It was the feeling of being in the same room, yet knowing you were on entirely different planets. And it taught me, early on, that some battles are fought not with words, but with an echoing silence that slowly erodes. The unraveling. A life-altering moment. The moment arrived in the form of a phone call, late on a Tuesday evening. My husband, David, had been laid off, abruptly, without warning. It wasn't just a job, it was our entire foundation. The startup he'd poured years into had collapsed, taking with it our savings, our sense of security, and the neat, ordered future I'd always envisioned. I remember standing in our small kitchen, the phone still warm against my ear. The silence in our apartment suddenly deafening. It felt like the ground beneath me had dissolved, leaving me suspended, grasping for something, anything, to hold on to. In that moment of pure panic, my first instinct was to call my father, a plea for presence, met with polite aversion. I called him the next morning. My voice was tight, a frantic edge I couldn't quite hide. I explained everything: David's job, the financial strain, the gnawing fear that was rapidly consuming me. I wasn't asking for money, not directly. I was asking for reassurance, for guidance, for a moment of shared burden with the man who was supposed to be my anchor. His response was measured, calm, almost clinical. "Well, that's a tough break, isn't it?" he said, his voice as smooth as polished wood. He offered generic advice about looking for new opportunities and tightening our belts. There was no empathy, no probing questions about how I was feeling, no offer of a visit, or even a simple, "I'm sorry this is happening to you." It was as if I was recounting a news report, not a personal catastrophe. A familiar pattern. It was the same quiet rejection I'd known my whole life, just amplified by the intensity of my need. The emotional equivalent of patting me on the head while watching my house burn down. My mother, when I told her, listened with her usual gentle concern, but her next words were, "You know your father. He doesn't like to get involved in other people's troubles." It wasn't an excuse but a statement of fact, a resigned acceptance of his permanent emotional absence. If you've ever felt emotionally abandoned by a parent, please consider liking this video. The weight of unacknowledged pain. The impact wasn't a sudden explosion of anger, but a slow, heavy ache. First came the shock, a disbelief that his response could be so utterly devoid of warmth. Then, a quiet grief, not for what was lost, but for what had never truly been there. It was the realization that in my moment of profound vulnerability, he had chosen the path of least resistance, silence, distance, and the preservation of his own perfectly calm surface. I started to see a pattern emerge, not just in this crisis, but in a lifetime of smaller, unacknowledged moments. The time I broke my arm, His concern was for the logistics of the hospital, not for my pain. The time I struggled with a difficult professor, his advice was to simply deal with it, rather than offering understanding. Each time the emotional connection I craved was met with a polite, functional barrier. The paradox of perception. A good man, community pillar. Outsiders saw Arthur as a pillar of the community. He volunteered at the local library, meticulously organizing shelves. He was known for his calm demeanor, his sensible advice, and his unwavering politeness. "Arthur is such a good man," Mrs. Henderson from next door would often say, admiring his well-kept garden. Internal disconnect. This public persona stood in stark contrast to the hollow space he left within our family. How could such a seemingly kind and functional man be so profoundly absent when it truly mattered? The dissonance was jarring, making my internal reality feel isolated and, at times, almost unreal. It was a private grief no one outside could see. Maintaining the image. His choice, I realized, was always to protect his own peace, his carefully curated image of a man who had everything under control. Engaging with my emotional turmoil would have required him to step outside that comfortable, controlled bubble to confront something messy and unpredictable. And that, it seemed, was a price he was never willing to pay. A lingering question. A quiet realization. The weeks that followed David's layoff were a blur of resumes, interviews, and mounting bills. My father called once, 2 months later, not to ask how we were doing, but to inquire about the status of a distant cousin's health. He mentioned David's situation in passing, a brief, almost perfunctory acknowledgement, before quickly moving on to safer topics like the weather. It was a micro-tension moment, a flicker of expectation met with the familiar cold reality. I remember thinking, he really just doesn't care. But it wasn't a malicious indifference. It was a profound inability, or perhaps unwillingness, to connect on a deeper level. The sting wasn't as sharp as the first time, replaced by a quiet, resigned understanding. This was simply who he was. Please consider following the channel if you find yourself connecting with this story. The slow process of emotional separation. There was no grand confrontation, no dramatic declaration. Instead, my emotional separation from him was a gradual, almost imperceptible shift, like two tectonic plates slowly drifting apart. I stopped reaching out to him with my vulnerabilities. I learned to lean on David, on my friends, on the strength I found within myself. It wasn't a conscious decision to cut him off, but rather a natural progression born of repeated disappointment. You learn, eventually, where to seek solace and where you will only find an echo. The silence that once felt like a wound began to feel like a boundary, a necessary distance for my own emotional well-being. It was a form of self-preservation, a quiet understanding that some wellsprings simply run dry. Acceptance, not forgiveness. I don't hate my father. I don't even resent him in the way I once did. What I feel now is a quiet acceptance of the reality of who he is, and more importantly, who he is not. He is still alive, still functional, still the polite, respected man in his community. He sends me Christmas cards and asks about my garden, but the emotional bridge between us remains unbuilt, deliberately left incomplete on his side. I've learned to live with that. Forgiveness feels too grand a word for something that was never an active offense, but rather a profound absence. It's more about acknowledging the landscape of our relationship, understanding its limitations, and finding peace within those boundaries. It's about accepting that some wounds don't heal with reconciliation, but with a clear-eyed understanding of their origins. The unfinished chapter. Sometimes I still catch myself looking for him in other people, for that deep, unwavering paternal presence I never truly had. It's a fleeting moment, a ghost of an old need, quickly dismissed. The echo of his silence still lingers, not as a sharp pain, but as a subtle undertone to my own voice, a reminder of the strength I found in building my own foundations. My father is still there, on the periphery of my life, a constant, polite fixture, and I am here, living a life shaped, in part, by the quiet spaces he left behind. It's an unfinished story, perhaps, but one I've learned to narrate on my own terms. The ending isn't neat or dramatic, but quiet, heavy, and real. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below.